E agora, na sequência, nós vamos falar de dados, mas não qualquer tipo de dados, nós vamos falar de análise e predicção. Não é isso aí?
A gente, como a gente comentou anteriormente, a gente sai um pouquinho da parte técnica, vai indo para a parte de estratégia, tecnologia e data, para falar de mercado, falar de o que a gente enxerga para frente e bater um papo principalmente do que está acontecendo aqui no Brasil, com dados dos principais players, categorias, regiões do Brasil, quem está crescendo, como que players de fora estão atuando no Brasil, para a gente ter poder se organizar, montar o nosso planejamento. E para fazer isso, a gente trouxe uma convidada, eu vou apresentar ela em português, depois eu vou trocar para o inglês, e que ela é responsável, analista do YipitData, ela traduz dados e insights digitais para clientes do setor de alimentos e restaurantes também. Ela trabalha, o YipitData trabalha com Forbes, Business Insider, Glossy e outras empresas. Antes de ingressar na YipitData, a Ariane ela foi consultora no setor, trabalhando na SimilarWeb. Ela começou a carreira no Gartner, onde liderou equipes de consultores para criar planos de estratégias digitais abrangentes para grandes marcas mundiais de consumo. Eu gostaria de apresentar e trazer no palco a Ariane Turley. Ariane, please. Salva de palmas, pessoal. Thank
you. Welcome.
Let's go back. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm very excited to be on stage here at Ecommerce Brasil. I hope you'll forgive me. I don't speak Portuguese at all, so please excuse my pronunciation, but I'll do my best. So today, my name is Ariane Turley, as I was so kindly introduced, and I'm Associate Director of Research at YipitData. So before I get started, I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction about YipitData. So YipitData is a research and insights firm based in New York City that publishes reports on public companies for both investors as well as corporations. And our reports are powered by a diverse array of data sources, all these data sources that you listed here, from email receipt data, web data, card transactional data, app downloads, et cetera. And what we do is we take all of these different diverse data sources and synthesize them into reports that we then distribute to companies as well as investors to help understand actionable insights and sort of trends that are going on in the marketplace. We've actually been covering the Latin American market for a very long time, since about 2014, and have a lot of data and interesting data that I'll sort of walk you guys through today. I also wanted to just highlight here kind of a shameless plug, but YipitData acquired a company called Edison back in September of 2021, and Edison powers Edison Mail, which is the #1 independent email app for iOS, Android, and Mac. And I'm really excited to announce that Edison actually just launched in Portuguese a couple of months ago, and we've already gotten a lot of really great press from sort of local media you can see here from Gizmodo Brazil. So I really suggest that you guys all check it out if you have some time. So with that, I'll jump right into the content today. So again, I'm kind of a data person. I'm a data nerd. I spend a lot of time looking and crunching at numbers. So you'll see a lot of data in these charts, but I'm really trying to make sure that you guys understand what the data is telling us. So I'm going to start off with sort of an industry overview, looking at the state of e-commerce in Brazil, understanding sort of the high-level trends of e-commerce, sort of what the biggest players are doing, et cetera. Then I'm going to look at sort of what's driving growth, right? So understanding category trends across the major e-commerce retailers in Brazil, but also in the United States a little bit. And then finally doing a deep dive into shipping and logistics, and ending a little bit on sort of looking ahead and what this all means for the future of e-commerce in Latin America. So industry overview. So kind of starting at a high level, what we're looking at here is that e-commerce is just continuing to grow, with Mercado Libre sort of reaching over 6.5 billion reals in sales. Just really, really quite astounding. I mean, I think there's really two things that we want to point out from this chart. I think the first is that we saw e-commerce hugely accelerate starting in sort of the onset of COVID. I'm sure that's not a surprise to any of you guys. That's why you're all here today. But the other thing I want to point out here is Shoppie, which is the yellow line there. And Shoppie has just seen tremendous growth in sort of Brazil in the last sort of year and a half. You can see that actually in May of 2022, they reached over 1.5 billion reals in sales, which is just really astounding. But what we're starting to see, I think one of the questions that people have is, okay, obviously we saw this huge acceleration of e-commerce growth because of COVID, but how can that be sustained? I think a lot of the questions in Brazil are, there's a lot of inflationary pressures, CPI is really increasing in the region especially, and what we're starting to see is that year-over-year growth is starting to slow. So you can see both Meli and Magalu, they had huge increases in growth, right, in most of 2020, growing over 100 to 200% year on year. But looking at the last 6 months, especially Magalu has been hit especially hard. Starting in March 2022, they've started to see declines in their growth of GMV. And I think a lot of this is because of their strength in sort of high-priced and high-ticket items, right? So if we look at this is looking at average sale prices. So basically what the average consumer is buying on these platforms and how average sale prices are growing. And so what we can see is that for both, I think there's two things here. First is for Magalu, average sale prices are high, and I think this is why that they've actually their growth has been slowing down is because people tend to go to the platform to buy high-ticket items like appliances, vehicle accessories, et cetera. And as costs of goods are rising, as inflation is rising, we're starting to see that people aren't buying as much on the platform as well, and this average sale price is actually declining. And so you can sort of see this is the percent change in ASP, or average sale price, between 2022 and 2020. And both Meli and Magalu have seen tremendous declines. But I think the interesting thing to point out here is Shoppie. So obviously Shoppie, their average sale prices in general are very low. I think people spend somewhere between like 5 and 10 reals per order, so really, really cheap items. And I think they're actually been able to see growth, and they're actually starting to see their average sale prices increase. And I think what's interesting about Shoppie, and one of the things that we talk about a lot, is that one of the reasons that they've been so successful is that they're bringing people who traditionally weren't in e-commerce, or the things that people traditionally didn't buy online, into e-commerce, right? So I was just hanging out with a friend in Sao Paulo. Her parents own a small store in Japantown here, and they're now on Shoppie, so really bringing in these mom and pop sellers. And we can really see this here, right? So this is the number of sellers on Shoppie Brazil, and you can see they're really starting to invest in their local sellers. So again, it's really bringing in these mom and pop shops that sell random kitchen appliances or beauty products or squeeze toys or something for your dog that are on Shoppie, and really accelerating the e-commerce growth in the region. So this is looking, again, at sort of the number of sellers on the platform. So you can see overseas sellers has been pretty stable, but the number of local sellers is really astounding, and they now have about 250,000 unique sellers on their platform. But I think what's interesting, though, is like we're starting to see the seller count level out, and I don't think that's a sign of Shoppie's growth stagnating, but really what it is instead that they're starting to formalize their e-commerce presence in the region, and formalize their e-commerce presence in Brazil specifically. So this is looking at the number of official sellers, or people who are like Shoppie mall sellers, which would be like if Nike or something sells directly on Shoppie, that's what's included here. And what we're starting to see is that the number of official sellers has also really started to grow. This is only looking at January 2021 when they kind of introduced the platform, right? And now there's over 200 official sellers on the platform. I think the other thing that we've seen, I don't have it shown here, is that the number of verified sellers on the platform has also continued to grow. So again, they're really formalizing their e-commerce presence and also bringing in these people who traditionally didn't sell online to now sell online. But I think, there's obviously a lot of growth that's happening, but I think what people are interested in is trying to understand, okay, what are these category trends, right? What's actually driving the growth, What are people buying on Shoppie versus Meli versus Magalu? So again, this is more data, but essentially what we're looking at here is the category share of GMV on Mercado Libre and sort of the year-over-year, the change over the last 2 years. And so at the beginning of January of 2020, what this was showing, I'll use the laser pointer feature here, is that about probably like 30% of sales total were coming from either computers, mobile phones, and electronics, or vehicle accessories. But the share of sales coming especially from computers, mobile phones, and electronics has really declined. And some of these smaller categories, right, like I think home and furniture is really growing a lot, and health and beauty are also seeing tremendous growth on the platform. And I think what's actually interesting about this is a trend that we're seeing worldwide. And so home and furniture is actually one of the fastest growing categories on Amazon as well. And I think one of the reasons that some of these categories are growing, again, is sort of due to these inflationary pressures. And so again, this is looking at average sale price by category, right? So looking specifically on one platform, trying to understand what people are buying, but then also how much people are spending by category. And what we're starting to see is that for a lot of these larger ticket items, they're getting a lot more expensive. So again, computers, mobile phones, electronics, the prices have increased about 13% year on year. And I think that's what's really driving those declines in sales as well. People are no longer sort of able to afford these big ticket items. And we're starting to see the same trends in Magalu. So this is looking, again, at the same sort of data as category share on Magalu. So looking at appliances is sort of in that dark blue line, mobiles and telephones as well. And you can see, traditionally Magalu was really strong in vehicle accessories, technologies, that kind of thing. And they're starting to see that share of sales decline as well. And instead, people are, again, buying these smaller products that they traditionally didn't buy online. So things like home and furniture, again, is something that we're really seeing growing. We're also seeing health and beauty, sort of these similar things. And I think what's really interesting, so this is kind of taking a look at the US, right, and trying to understand, okay, how does what's going on in Brazil compare to what's going on in the United States on Amazon? And I think, in some ways, the United States is kind of a more mature, or especially Amazon, a more mature e-commerce market. And Amazon, as you guys probably know, started 20 or 25 years ago just selling books. But what we're starting to see is that as Amazon continues to grow, it's really become this one-stop shop for everything that you would want to buy. There's no single category that dominates as these markets mature. So in Amazon, the largest category is, actually now it's home and furniture, so similar to what we're seeing in Melli and Magalu. But it still only accounts for about under 15% of sales. And actually, people aren't just buying one thing, they're buying everything. And I think this is something that we could probably expect to see happen in the next 3 to 5 years, right, as markets mature, if we look towards the United States, of maybe people starting to buy everything online. And then I think this also ties into sort of what's going on in Shoppie. So this is the same look, but looking at category share of GMV again. And it's the same thing of sort of the same story of bringing in these non-traditional products into the fold. So looking at these huge increases in fashion, home and living, things like that, and really thriving in these lower cost items. But I think, this is great when we think about what categories are growing, right? Home and furniture, those things are easier to ship. Well, not furniture, but a lot of these home products. But one of the big questions in Brazilian e-commerce is, if this growth can be sustained given the shipping and logistics infrastructure. And I think we're starting to see a lot of these companies invest heavily in shipping and logistics. And so we wanted to understand, how do these different companies compare in their shipping and logistics infrastructure, and sort of what kind of investments that they've made, and how that can kind of inform what the future will look like. So what we did is we actually did a study of average shipping times by platform. So this is looking at average shipping times from Mercado Libre, Magalu, as well as Shoppie, also versus the average shipping cost. So what we actually found is that Melli has the fastest shipping times, and they've clearly spent a lot of time sort of investing in their logistics platform, right? And Magalu has the longest shipping times and the most expensive shipping costs that are borne by consumers. And I think a lot of this, again, can be explained by their larger ticket items, but it's also their investments in their logistics infrastructure. I think what's interesting is that they're growing their number of third-party sellers, but then when you buy something third-party on Magalu, which I'll go into later, it takes a lot longer to ship. And so there's a lot of questions that they're trying to wrestle with of, like, how do they actually compete? But sort of unsurprisingly, Brazil is a big country, right? And so what we see is that these shipping times actually really vary significantly by region. And so this is looking at the median estimated delivery time by region. So in Sao Paulo, for example, here it's a big city, there's a lot of infrastructure here. The median estimated time of delivery can be under 2 days. So similar to like what Amazon is doing in the United States. So really, really fast. But if you look at, and Magalu actually competes quite well in these cities, and Shoppie is actually the slowest. But what's interesting is that Shoppie is better at delivering sort of faster in these more remote regions in Brazil versus Magalu. So if you look at like Boa Vista or something like that, right, it could take maybe 3 weeks for your product to get there if you order on Magalu, and Shoppie can be 8 days faster. And so it's really hard to imagine how do you compete on a larger scale, especially if that's where a lot of the e-commerce growth is coming from. And so I think what's interesting, though, about Meli is, like, why has Meli been able to have such strong logistics, or Mercado Libre, and, like, why have they, really been so successful in having fast delivery times? Why is it so much cheaper? And I think a lot of this is because they're really investing heavily in their logistics services penetration. So if you guys sell on Meli, there's actually 3 main options that we think about in terms of how you can ship your product. There's cross-docking and flex penetration, which is basically using Meli's in-house logistics services, or you can use like a local carrier, which is a lot slower. And what we see is that Meli is really investing in cross-docking and flex penetration, as well as their own fulfillment penetration across the region, but especially in Brazil. So this is actually looking at like all Latin American countries, or not all, but like a lot of Latin American countries where Meli is available. And Brazil is in the yellow line. And you can see that in the beginning of January of 2022, only about 25% of GMV for Meli was from cross-docking or flex penetration, but now it's much closer to 60%. So really investing heavily in this. And I think this has a big impact on their logistics. And we can see this when we look at sort of average shipping types and logistics when we're looking at on Meli specifically, right? So this is looking just on Mercado Libre, what the average delivery times and the average shipping costs is based on the different types of fulfillment options that you have. So when you look at their own in-house fulfillment, for example, it's about a week to get something. And these numbers are actually starting to decline a little bit. But when you look at like cross-docking or flex, it's about 8 days. And so really thinking about if you're a seller on these platforms, okay, what's the best shipping and logistics infrastructure for you to use, but then also thinking about what effect this has on the consumer as well. And now we're going to take a look at Magalu and thinking about sort of what Magalu's shipping infrastructure looks like. So this is Magalu's average estimated time of delivery for their first-party versus third-party platforms, and then also the average shipping cost for their first-party versus third-party, both borne by the customer as well as borne by the operational one. So I'm going to start talking about the graph on the left. So this is just looking at estimated time of delivery. And I think what's interesting is that third-party sellers take a lot longer to ship their products than first-party sellers. And this is kind of a problem for the company because they're increasing their percentages of sellers that are selling via 3P. So if you look at Magalu, I think now about 60% of their sellers are third-party sellers. And what's interesting, too, though, is even though first party is much faster, but it's a lot more expensive for Magalu. And so when you look at the 1P customers versus operational, you can see that Magalu is actually losing probably about 30 reals on every delivery that they're making because there's, it's only cost about 40, I think. Sorry, it's hard for me to see. About 40 reals for the customer, but for the shipper itself, it costs about 70. And so there's this really big difference, right? And so I think what's something that they really have to think about if they want to continue to succeed in this region, continue to compete with some of these newer players like Meli or Shoppie or something like that. They really have to think about how do they increase their logistics penetration, how do they really improve sort of their logistics services. And I think Shoppie is an interesting one. We've seen Shoppie grow a lot, but one of Shoppie's problems is that they also have very slow delivery times and have been really unable to compete. And I think what we're seeing is that, originally Shoppie relied very heavily on the local postal service, which, as I'm sure you guys know, is quite slow in terms of logistics and fulfillment in Brazil. But what's interesting is that they're really investing heavily in their logistics infrastructure, and they're actually moving away from Correios in favor of Shoppie Express. So if you look in April of 2022, about 60% of all Shoppie listings were fulfilled using the local postal service. But this number has actually declined by about 10% just in the last 3 months, which is pretty significant. And I think what we're going to start to see is that as they continue to sort of move away and as they continue to shorten their time, as they continue to invest in sort of logistics in Brazil, this is only going to decline. And I think they're going to start to see a lot more people use Shoppie Express versus Courios. And you can actually already start to see this inverse happening, right? If you look here, it's really declining as the light blue charts are increasing. And I think this is good for them because if you look at Courios, right, like the maximum time of delivery can be somewhere between 20 and 25 days. That's 3 weeks, which is a really long time. I mean, I think if you look in Amazon, right, like I think 90% of 90% of Amazon customers use Prime, and Prime guarantees 2-day delivery. And you see at Shoppie, for example, the minimum is still 10 days and the maximum is 25 days. And so when you think about this, there really needs to be a lot more investment in their fulfillment centers, in their own sort of in-house logistics penetrations in order to really succeed in the region. So I just threw a lot of data at you, a lot of different charts, a lot of sort of information about what's going on in e-commerce in Brazil, sort of the shipping and logistics infrastructure. But I think, I wanted to understand, or I wanted to take a little bit of time to really synthesize what I was thinking and sort of look ahead and sort of understand what this means for the future of e-commerce in Brazil. And I think what we're starting to see is that obviously e-commerce is growing very quickly, right? But how can that growth be sustained without a strong shipping and logistics fulfillment? But then also, without investment in sort of other sectors. And so what we're starting to see is that they're really doing continued investments in new sectors to create new retail concepts. So I think the interesting thing I wanted to point out here is Shoppie, right? They're obviously doing a lot more Shoppie Express, but we're also seeing is that they're opened 5 new distribution centers in Brazil. And this is really a way that they're showing, okay, they're doubling down even, they're going to continue to find growth in the region, and they're really doubling down on their logistics services as well as their sort of distribution services in the region. But I think the other one I wanted to talk about here too is Magalu, right? And I think a lot of the conversations that we've been hearing on the ground is how does Magalu compete with Meli? Their logistics platform isn't necessarily as strong, and their growth is starting to slow down a little bit. And I think what's interesting is that Magalu has really started to invest in a lot of different industries and sectors and doing a lot of acquisitions to continue their growth. But one of the things that we thought was quite interesting is sort of their new payment systems and really incentivizing people to use that. And I think that's one of the ways that we can sort of start to see this growth happening. And I think this is actually taking a playbook from what we're seeing in other regions, right? So even in Amazon or in China and WeChat, for example, where they do a lot of various WeChat payment situations and things like that. So I think, for Brazil, the future of e-commerce is really bright. It's really strong. There's a lot of growth opportunities, but there's still a lot of challenges that need to be figured out, namely logistics as well as payment options. And I think these companies are still learning a lot from that. So thank you guys so much. Obrigada. But yeah, thank you so much. And I really appreciate the opportunity.
Ariane, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, I'll sit. Do you have any? Oh, okay. Do I have to put it on? Okay. The questions?
Yes.
Great.
A gente vai abrir para perguntas, pessoal. Ela está com tradução ou qualquer coisa eu faço a tradução. Quem tem perguntas? Querem fazer perguntas? Pergunta?
Hello.
Here on the left
Yeah.
side.
Do you have any data on issues, complaints, or returns on e-commerce Brazil compared to US? Or maybe you can share your thoughts with us.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. So I don't have the data off the top of my head ready, but we do actually, we're able to break out sort of GMV with and without returns in our data, and we can sort of understand how that sort of operates. I think in the US, it's interesting, like obviously returns is a really big problem for some of these companies. I think we saw like Zara now, for example, they're gonna start charging people for returns. And so I think, in Brazil, it seems like people are still very much focused on hyper growth, and so that's not as much of a concern, but I think it'll be interesting in 5 or 10 years to see if we have more of that, but I can definitely look into it as well in our data.
As perguntas? Primeiro ali no lado direito no fundo, depois aqui na frente. Pode fazer em português a pergunta, pessoal, se quiser, ou em inglês, como sentir mais fácil. À direita, isso.
Hi there. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very nice to see all those data, clarify loads of things that are happening. But I would like to know a little bit more about live commerce trend. We know that in China, it's not a trend, it's a reality. And what's your vision for Brazil about live commerce, live commerce trend here?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I didn't hear it. Oh, Brazil. Okay, I think that's a good question. And I think something that's interesting about Brazil versus the US even, and China, I think Brazil is very much a mobile-first country. And I think for Magalu, for example, almost 60% of all their sales come from their app. And I think that's much more similar to what we're seeing in China versus what we see in the United States. And so I think mobile first is definitely one of them, and also the huge opportunities for growth in sort of these more rural regions, right? I think one of the reasons that China has been so successful in e-commerce is they kind of skipped the whole credit card phase. You know, people went from cash to using digital payments, using things like WeChat payment. And when you bought something on the street, they just immediately used WeChat payment. And I think I saw something similar in Brazil. I mean, I got all this cash out, and I didn't even have a chance to use it because even the guy who's selling, you know, coconut on the street takes payments now. And I think that kind of advancements in payments as well as sort of mobile-first technology is much more similar to what we're seeing in China than the United States.
And it's specific about live commerce. Do you see there is a difference between China and the US? How do you see Brazil? I don't know if you guys have data specifically on the live commerce.
Live commerce?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, okay. So that's a good one too. I mean, in China, there's a lot of live streaming, right?
Yes.
And a lot of people like Tmall, for example, which is like the Alibaba, they have all of these, in China they call them KOLs, key opinion leaders, where they do a lot of live streaming to sell products that you can buy instantaneously. And I think in the US we've seen them start to do that on Amazon, but it's not as successful. People aren't doing that as well. And I looked at the Shoppie app, for example, while I was here just to go through and download. I was like, there's a lot more, it looks a lot more similar to Tmall than it does to Amazon. There's a lot more promotions that are being thrown at you. You know, you can save coupons all the time. I think there's a lot more investment in that kind of thing.
Okay, we start seeing here in Brazil, Shine and Shoppie doing those type of things here in Brazil with Brazilian influencers and try them to create this. You don't see that in the US working, right?
Definitely not. I mean, Amazon, if you look at it, there's no, I think like on Shoppie, you know, they're always throwing like coupons in your face. Yeah. They're always throwing, promotions that you can have for free shipping and all those sorts of things. And it's definitely not the same in the US at all.
Tinha uma outra aqui no fundo, que estava com a mão levantada, por favor. Aqui, isso. Ali. Só levanta a mão para o pessoal te ver para levar o microfone. Isso. Depois aqui na frente.
What about the two other big players in the Brazilian market, that is the B2W and Via Varejo?
Yeah.
How they compete with the three other big ones? Yeah,
no, that's a really good question. I realized my presentation was really focused on sort of the three players that we have data on at YipitData. But I think that you know, Via Varejo, like Amazon obviously is making a big push in Brazil as well, Americana. So I have like an app download slide as well as like a web traffic download slides. But I think, you know, Meli, Maglu are still the two largest ones, and Shoppie is just seeing tremendous growth, which is why I decided to focus on these two for today.
Okay.
Or three.
Oh,
thank you.
Hey, Ariane, what's up? First and foremost, congrats on your presentation. I would like to ask you about something a little bit more on the technology perspective. As someone who studies e-commerce from outside of Brazil, how do you see the headless e-commerce movement from outside? And do you think that could be something which would become a go-to for e-commerces and new e-commerces in our country in the future?
What was the question? The headless?
Yeah, headless commerce architecture and multi-channel.
Sorry, can you? It was the headless commerce. Oh, I don't know what that is.
The headless architecture. We have multi-channels. So if you see this is a good strategy for e-commerce in Brazil right now, this is in the US.
Right. Is it like omnichannel is the same concept?
Headless e-commerce is.
That works for the
Okay. Oh, the architect. Okay, sorry. It's taking me a while to understand exactly what you're asking about. No, I mean, I think that's a good question, and I think, like, you know, in something that we've seen, like in China and even in the U.S., right, is we have like a lot of one of the reasons like WeChat has been so successful, for example, is like they're very vertically integrated, and so everything is kind of all lives within one platform and sort of like one ecosystem. And I think, you know, on WeChat, like a loyalty program, everything is all sort of in that one place, right? And I think in the US they're trying to do that, but not as successfully. I think Amazon, for example, has tried to go into a lot of different places like grocery, fashion, but they haven't been as able to replicate that. So I think I'll be curious to see, I mean, if Brazil would go more in the format of having sort of more connected, like online and offline experiences, and sort of more like digitally focused and sort of vertically integrated in the background. I think, does that answer your question? I'd be curious. We can talk offline too, so we can chat more about it.
Thank you.
Mais uma, pessoal. Levantou com tanta felicidade assim, falei, é essa.
Estou empolgada. Eu vou em português, aí você me ajuda a traduzir, tá? Que eu não
tá
formulei super na minha cabeça. Tá tendo uma movimentação muito forte. Eu conversei com a B2W esses dias, que é Americanas, e outros marketplaces também, a Amazon, trazendo cross-border para o Brasil. Eu queria entender uma comparação, como que o cross-border está hoje nos Estados Unidos, em relação aos marketplaces, se tem uma representatividade bacana disso lá fora, e qual a sua visão do cross-border aqui para o Brasil?
Okay, yeah. Are you asking about cross-border coming from Brazil to the US or US importing to Brazil?
US importing to Brazil and China importing to Brazil. China mainly and US too.
No. Right. I was wondering which way it was. No, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think in the US, cross-border e-commerce is not as big as it is in other regions. You know, I think a lot of times things are very contained within the ecosystem, or if you're buying a good that's cross-border, you don't necessarily know it because you go on Amazon and you just buy sort of whatever is the top from a consumer-facing perspective, right? Versus I know in China, for example, cross-border e-commerce is very big. People want to buy goods from overseas. I think what's interesting is that in Brazil, I think, you know, what we saw originally when Shoppie first started, they're really big on cross-border e-commerce, but as they've doubled down in the region, they're actually investing a lot more in their local sellers and not doing as much cross-border, and I think that's probably a more effective growth strategy for them.
Thank you.
In the US, you don't see other marketplaces beside Amazon doing a strategy of cross-border, trying to import goods from other countries?
No, I mean, I think it's interesting, like not so much on Amazon or Walmart or Target. I mean, cross-border e-commerce in the US is a lot more niche. So for example, there's a platform called like Yummy Buy, which is very big, but it's about importing Chinese goods from abroad, but it's very niche. You know, it's never going to it's only serving that one specific market for people who want to buy Chinese groceries in the United States. And so I think it's, you know, people will seek it out if they want it, but it's not infiltrating sort of the general retail system.
Perfect. Ariane, thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Palmas, pessoal. Obrigado.
E aí, gostou do vídeo? Então não deixe de curtir e compartilhar. Aqui do lado tem 2 sugestões que você pode gostar. Até a próxima!